100 years ago this year, two brothers, Adi and Rudolf, started what they called the Dassler Brothers Sports Shoe Factory. Their company quickly began to grow and became famous not only in Germany, but also across the world. Especially when American Jesse Owens wore their shoes at the 1936 Olympic Games when he won 4 gold medals. But tensions simmered between the brothers and between their families over a whole range of issues, both in their personal life and in their business. And so eventually in 1948, Adi and Rudolf fell out. And they founded firms on either side of the river in their town. Those firms, called Adidas and Puma, went on to experience huge success in business. But the division between these brothers split their community. Families were torn apart as workers from Adidas didn't speak to workers in Puma and vice versa. Restaurants, shops, even schools were forced to pick sides, which one they were going to support. And this once close-knit community earned the nickname the Town of Bent Necks. Because when people met each other, the first thing they did was look down and look at their shoes to see which group they supported, Adidas or Puma. But probably saddest of all, Adi and Rudolf never reconciled. And when they died, they were buried on opposite sides of the cemetery in the town, forever symbolising their conflict. Now, of course, this family, the Dassler family, is not the only family that have been divided. Sadly, many families have experienced disagreements and conflict and breakup. Even happens in God's family. Abraham, too, experienced this. But even in the mess of his family problems, God stepped into this situation in an amazing way that can teach us how to avoid making the same mistakes in our own personal and church lives. So we're going to read from Genesis chapter 21, verse 8 to 21, and Alison's going to come and she's going to read for us this morning. Thank you, Alison.
The child grew and was weaned. On the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that their son, whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham, was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly, because it concerned his son. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offsprings will be reckoned. It will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on their shoulders and sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down about a bus watch away. She thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him in by hand for I will make him into a great nation. The God opened her eyes and saw she a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt.
Thank you, Alison. On the day Isaac was weaned, Abram held a great feast. The weaning of a child, usually when they were between maybe 2 or 3 years old, was an important landmark in a child's life, especially when infant mortality was so high. So this should have been a day of great celebration. And of course, the joy was deeper for Abraham and Sarah because Isaac, this little boy, was their miracle baby. The fulfillment of incredible promises from God. As we saw last time, Sarah recognized that God has brought me laughter. This was God's gift to them. But not everybody that day was laughing in the same way. Ishmael, who was by this stage maybe about 15 or 16, 17 years old, he also was laughing. But he wasn't sharing in the joy of that day of celebration. Instead, he was laughing at Isaac. Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking, verse 9 says. You'll remember Isaac's name. It means he laughs. So in a sense, Ishmael was Isaacing Isaac. He was laughing at Isaac. But it's not exactly clear what he was doing here. Was he making fun of the promises that God had given to Isaac? Was he just tormenting his little brother? Paul says that he persecuted him. But his motivation, whatever he was doing, his motivation seems clear. It seems that Ishmael was envying Isaac. Up to this point, Ishmael had his dad all to himself. He was Abraham's heir. But now everything had changed. Now Isaac had taken the limelight. Ishmael had been demoted. And so he took out the pain of that on little Isaac. And if we're being honest, we too can fall into the trap of envying. Envying others, even envying other believers. Their blessings, their ministries, their answered prayers, their successes. Paul even spoke about people who preach Christ out of envy and rivalry. Their motivation in sharing the gospel was not a love for the lost, but was because they envied the prominence and position that Paul had. So envy can impact any of our hearts, can seep in, can take hold. Envy changed this day of joy into a day of dispute and argument. And it led to a serious division in this family. Sarah went straight to Abraham. Verse 10. Get rid of that slave woman and her son. For that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Perhaps we can understand how she felt. When our children are attacked, our parental instinct can make us to jump to their defence. I'm sure you've noticed that, those of us who are parents here. She saw Ishmael as a threat to her son's future, and so she acted to jealously guard her son's inheritance. But of course, she was being completely unfair, wasn't she? She herself had made Hagar a surrogate wife for Abraham. So it was just wrong for her to dismiss Hagar and her son just when she had her own son. And it was completely selfish. Sarah made no attempt here to understand the feelings of Ishmael. She made no allowance for his age. And she showed no concern for him or his mum. She just wanted rid of them. And also this was a conflict that had been simmering, unresolved for years. Maybe you can remember back when Hagar became pregnant, how she began to despise her mistress. And in retaliation, Sarah abused Hagar. So badly that Hagar ran away. And that issue had never been resolved. So this was a conflict that had been just going on and on. Sarah's demand was not only unfair, not only unloving, it was also unforgiving. And it ripped Abraham's family apart. When you look at that, you're no wonder that James wrote, where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Envy divides people. It destroys families. Think of Cain and Abel. Cain murdered Abel because his brother's offering was more acceptable than his. Or think about Joseph, how he was sold as a slave by his brothers because they envied his favoured position as the favourite among the family, especially his dad. Or how the conflict that happened between Moses and Miriam and Aaron, because Miriam and Aaron envied Moses' prominent leadership role in the nation. This is what Billy Graham said about envy. Envy can ruin reputations, split churches, cause murders. Envy can shrink our circle of friends, ruin our business, and dwarf our souls. And it also causes despair. This all broke Abraham's heart. Verse 11. The matter distressed Abraham greatly, because it concerned his son. This word distressed here, it literally means shake violently. It's a really strong emotional response. Abraham was horrified by Sarah's suggestion. How could Sarah demand that he get rid of his own son? Of course, he loved Isaac, but he also loved Ishmael. How could he be asked to choose one over the other? And had it not been for God's command, I don't think Abraham would have agreed to Sarah's suggestion. But God told him to listen to whatever Sarah tells you in verse 12. And so Abraham obeyed. Next morning he got some food and water, gave it to Hagar, and sent her off with the boy. No doubt with tears in his eyes and pain in his heart. So it was tragic for Abraham, but of course it was also tragic for Hagar and Ishmael. Seemed like they didn't know what to do. So they just kind of wandered in the desert until their food and water ran out. Then Hagar put her dying son under a bush for a bit of shade. And she sat at a distance from him because she couldn't watch her son slowly dying. And she began to sob. This is real suffering here, isn't it? And it was so unnecessary. God had so blessed Abraham that he had more than enough to provide for his whole family. But envy and jealousy had caused this harsh dispute, this deep division, and this heartbreaking despair. It's a serious warning to all of us. Envy and jealousy are dangerous. So as Peter says in his letter, rid yourself of all malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of any kind. We need to guard against this sin in our lives, in our families, in our church. Because if we allow it in, it will cause disputes, it will cause division, it will cause despair. So this passage is a warning to us. But this passage also, I think, causes us to ask a really tough question. If Ishmael and Sarah's motives here in this middle of this conflict were so wrong, why did God tell Abraham to listen to Sarah and send Ishmael away? Why would God get a dad to send his son and his wife off into the desert? Why did God say that? Well, this question actually helps us to see two keys to overcoming envy in our own lives. So first of all, God told Abraham to send him away because he had a different plan for Isaac and for Ishmael. God agreed to Sarah's demands not because it fitted in with her selfish ambition, but because it was his will. Verse 12, he said, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Isaac, not Ishmael, was God's promised son to Abraham. So God would establish his covenant with Isaac. Isaac would receive God's blessing. Ishmael, well, he'd been born as a result of Abraham and Sarah taking matters into their own hands. It was not God's plan. But neither their mistake, nor Abraham's love for his other son, nor Sarah's cruel treatment of that Ishmael, none of that would change God's will for Isaac. God removed Ishmael from this family to establish his plan for Isaac. But actually in doing this, God was actually pointing forward. Pointing forward to how he would work in our lives through Jesus. This is what Paul brings out in his letter to the Galatians. Paul taught that Hagar represents the old covenant of the law. She stands for, she's an illustration of that old covenant given through Moses to the people of Israel. And her son, Ishmael, was born in the ordinary way. He was just born like every other kid is born. And he was born into slavery. So he's an illustration of those born into the slavery of the old covenant with the hundreds of rules and regulations. That's Hagar. Sarah, however, represents the new covenant of grace. Her son Isaac was born by the power of the Spirit in fulfillment of a promise. So Isaac represents all of us who have been born again by the Spirit through our faith in Jesus and his death on the cross. Hagar represents the old covenant. Ishmael, everybody who's in slavery to that. Isaac, or Sarah, represents the new covenant, and Isaac represents all of us who have been born again into that. And just as Ishmael, in this passage, persecuted Isaac, so in Paul's day, the Jews in the Old Covenant were persecuting the Christians in the New. And then, Sarah's demand to get rid of that slave woman and her son is taken up by Paul as a call to the church. Not to get rid of somebody, but to get rid of the slavery to the old covenant, to the rules and the regulations of the law, and that old covenant way of approaching God through sacrifice and ritual. And instead enter into the freedom that we have through our faith in Jesus. He says, after talking about this, he says it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. So just as Sarah demanded that Hagar and Ishmael be kicked out of her family, so this church should push out of anyone, or that demand to be put into the slavery of the Old Testament, the old law, the Old Covenant law. So in the middle of this family tragedy, God was actually preparing a picture to teach us the amazing truth of the freedom that we have in Christ. Because like Isaac, we've been born by the Spirit in fulfillment of a promise. And it's we who will inherit the blessing of God. This was God's plan for Isaac. And it was a good plan. But God also had a good plan for Ishmael. Look at verse 13. God said to Abraham, "And I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring." Abram, he didn't need to worry about Ishmael, because God was going to make him into a nation as well. Now, of course, that doesn't excuse Sarah's selfishness. It just means that God was going to work through her selfishness to accomplish his plan. Like what happened in Joseph's life. Remember the story of Joseph? How Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers in a horrendous act of selfishness and cruelty. And yet later on, Joseph could say to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. What they did was wrong, but God was working for good in it." And he was doing the same here in Ishmael's life. Sarah, she didn't care about Hagar or Ishmael. She was willing to kick them out into the desert, probably to die. But God had a good plan for Ishmael too. And God would accomplish his plan. God had a good plan for Isaac. God had a good plan for Ishmael. And I think this is the key to defeating envy and jealousy in our own lives. It's great to remember that our lives are not an accident. That they're not a collection of random circumstances. God has been in control from day one. "All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be," David wrote in that famous Psalm, Psalm 139. But this truth can disturb us because our lives are not all the same. We've had different opportunities and challenges, different roles and responsibilities, different joys and different sorrows. So sometimes we might be tempted to envy the life that God has planned for somebody else. Why has that person got that life? Why is that person part of that family? Why is that person has seen those opportunities? Why have they received those blessings and I haven't? But we don't need to envy somebody else's life if we understand that God's plan for our lives is good. If we put our trust in Jesus and His sacrifice of Himself on the cross, then we know that God has predestined us to be adopted as His sons through Jesus Christ. He's chosen each of us to experience His love and grace, His forgiveness and His acceptance into His family. God's plan for our life is good. And even though we've been through different circumstances and experiences, we know that in all of them, God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. Even in the most painful of circumstances, God has been working for our good and for His glory. And then in the church, even though we have different gifts and different roles and responsibilities, none of them are lesser than others. All of these roles, all of these gifts that God has given to us are crucial and valuable gifts of His grace. As Paul says in Romans 12, we have different gifts according to the grace given us. So this is why James wrote that envy is earthly, unspiritual, and of the devil. Earthly, unspiritual, and of the devil. Envy comes from a worldly way of thinking. When we follow our fallen human nature, and like the devil, we rebel against God's will. Because when you boil it down, envy is saying that God's plan for my life is not good enough. It's not good enough. But we don't need to be like that. Instead, we can humbly and gratefully accept. I'm fighting the weather today. We can humbly and gratefully accept whatever God's plan is for us. Because we can rest on the fact that God's plan for us is His good and pleasing and perfect will. So we don't need to envy what somebody else has. We don't need to envy what God has planned for them. Like how God had a different plan for Isaac and Ishmael, we can accept that God has a different plan for each one of us, and God's plan is always best. We can trust Him. But there's another reason why Abraham could agree to Sarah's demand. Sarah wanted Abraham to abandon Ishmael. But God instead was asking Abraham to trust Him, to trust His faithfulness, to care for Ishmael. And we can see this faithfulness expressed in this passage in three ways. Very briefly, God was faithful in hearing their prayer. The angel said to Hagar, "Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there." Ishmael was lying in that bush, slowly dying of thirst, crying in pain. But God heard him crying. In fact, if you remember, that's what Ishmael, his name, means. It means God hears. And this is this incredible truth we know. You hear, O Lord, the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them and you listen to their cry. Psalm 10 says. This is who our God is. He's the God who hears us, who is faithful to us in prayer. He's also the God who provides. God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. God gave them life, even in the face of death. Even in the desert experiences of our lives, the times when our resources have run out, when nobody else is around to help us, we can depend on the one who can bring water out of the desert place, who can bring joy out of mourning, who can bring life out of death. So instead of looking to other people and envying what they have, we can trust that, as Paul wrote, my God will meet all your needs according to His glorious riches in Christ Jesus. Don't look at what other people have. Look to God, the one who promises to provide us everything we need. God was faithful in prayer and in His provision, but He was also faithful in His presence. Look at verse 20. God was with the boy as he grew up. Ishmael's life did not end here when he was sent out from Abram's family, because God was with him. And God's presence made all the difference. And that's the ultimate reason why we who have trusted in Jesus don't need to be envious of anybody. We can be content because if we have Jesus, we have everything we need. We have everything we need. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, the writer of Hebrews says. Because God has said, never will I leave you. Never will I forsake you. So yes, this is a tragic episode in Abram's life. Demonstrates the problem of envy. How it causes disputes and division and despair. And how it could do that even in the church. But it's a passage that's also filled with hope. Because it shows how God can enable us to overcome envy. Not by giving us everything that we want. Not by giving us more than everybody else. But by the fact that if we trust in Jesus, then we can rest in God's good plan for each of us. And in His faithfulness to care for us. To hear our prayers. To provide for our needs. And ultimately, to guarantee His presence with us.